What a pre-tribulational rapture belief requires. This is part 2, presented by myself, Richard L. Guthrie. Many are unaware of what a belief in the pre-tribulational rapture actually entails. They confidently and arrogantly assert that this position is a result of interpreting Scripture literally. Nothing could be farther from the truth. This study will reveal what a pre-tribulational rapture belief actually requires. Rules that have applied to this presentation: read the Scriptures carefully. Do not add anything to what's written. Do not omit anything that is written. I've stayed with the King James and will not be deviating from that. Again, for more information and more detailed information regarding this topic and other related topics, I highly recommend my book, The Rapture from the Ground Up. This particular topic is found in Appendix 4, Myths of the Pre-Tribulational Rapture. Let's continue reviewing the many requirements for a pre-tribulational rapture belief. Item 39. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to ignore that John did not mention a raptured church in heaven when he sees and records in detail everything else that he sees and hears in Revelation. There is much that is read and rewritten into the Scripture, which is a mere fabrication, just to hint that the church may be present in heaven. Item 40. A pre-tribulation rapture requires that the 24 elders are representative of a raptured church. An honest evaluation shows that the elders are redeemed, but have yet to receive the reward and their glorified body. In other words, they have not been raptured. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to ignore that John records in Revelation, after Revelation 4:1, where the rapture was supposedly have occurred, that there are souls in heaven that do not have glorified bodies, in other words, not raptured, and predate the beginning of the tribulation, the breaking of the seals. This makes a pre-tribulational rapture impossible. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that there are no identifiable signs left before the rapture. Jesus and Paul provide us with many events that need to occur before the rapture and the second coming. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that the open door offered to the Philadelphia church in Revelation chapter 3 is a promise for rapture, and is not what it really is, the opportunity for them to present the gospel to the world. A pre-tribulational rapture requires that you ignore the numerous references which indicate that the rapture and the second coming occur together. And I'll let you take a look at all those references yourself. There's numerous. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that only the first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters of Revelation were written to the church. This requires the dismissal of the promised blessing, which is personally and directly from Jesus, to those that read and keep the entire book, and that's found in Revelation 1:3. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that not all people wail when they see Jesus at the second coming, Revelation 1:7. If there were tribulation saints on the earth at the second coming, then not everyone would wail at the sight of Jesus. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that Christians will not know the times and seasons that Paul promised with regard to the rapture and the second coming, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 1. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to say that Matthew 24:31 is not the rapture. This is even when this verse states that the elect, believers and not Israel, are gathered from heaven and earth, the 4 winds, and sounds very much like the rapture, which is the only time living and deceased saints from the earth and from heaven will be gathered at the same time. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to say that the elect in Matthew 24 refers only to Israelites and not believers. Jesus clearly identifies in Matthew 24:24 and Mark 13:20 that the elect he is referring to are true believers. In other words, they are not Israel as a nation. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you not to believe Paul when he says that the church will see the day of the Lord, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 4. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to say that the church will not see the things listed in Luke chapter 21, verses 21 to 28. All of these events that Luke presents occur before the redemption or rapture of believers. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that there is a 7-year time interval indicated between verse 10, the marriage supper, and verse 11, the second coming of Revelation chapter 19. It would require you to assume that John overlooked inserting this longer time interval, even though he was very meticulous regarding the time intervals of many of the events in Revelation. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that there are notable and supposedly differences between the terms Day of the Lord, Day of Christ or Day of Jesus Christ, and Day of God. It is clear in Scripture that these terms are used interchangeably. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that the end-time apostate church is more special and precious to God than any church in history and deserves to be spared from the tribulation. This denigrates the lost lives of the early church martyrs and even modern-day Christian martyrs. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that the reason the Thessalonians grieved and had sorrow was because they thought the deceased believers would miss out on the rapture. Yet Paul was able to provide comfort by showing them that the deceased believers would have a part in the resurrection. 1 Thessalonians 4 verses 13 through 18. The Thessalonians began to believe that there was no resurrection, much like the Sadducees. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that the time of the Gentiles ends with the beginning of the tribulation, and not with the beginning of the millennial kingdom. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to mix up aspects of the second coming with aspects of the great white throne judgment. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that the rapture and the second coming are distinct events, which is true. Since they are different events, there must be a 7-year honeymoon between the groom, Christ, and the bride, the church, for the marriage supper and the judgment seat of Christ to occur. You then have to limit what God can accomplish within a twinkling of an eye and have now made an omnipotent God subject to the constraint of time. Since we will be spending an eternity with Jesus, even a 7-year honeymoon, under our current time references, would be inadequately short time. The honeymoon argument is just not biblically sound or even realistic. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that there are at least 7 more trumpets sounded. The trumpet judgment sound in Revelation 8 verses 7 through 11 and chapter 8 verse 7 through chapter 11 verse 15. After the sounding of the last trumpet that marks the rapture. This is not a strong argument since the trumpets are part of the temple worship and that is likely to be reintroduced during the millennium. Please note that the 7th trumpet judgment sounding signals an end to the 70th week of Daniel. This happens concurrently with the 7th seal and the 7th vial judgments. As its last of the 7 trumpet judgment sounds, it could very well be the same trumpet sounding for the rapture. A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe that the world can remember and correlate events that happen 7 years apart: rapture, bema seat of Christ, and second coming. The world doesn't even remember collectively events that occurred even 6 months ago, let alone be able to relate them together. However, the world is able to recognize that Jesus rewards the saints in Revelation 11:18, and at the same time recognize the second coming. Thy wrath is come. Does the whole world suddenly have divine inspiration and is given this knowledge? A pre-tribulational rapture requires you to believe in the miraculous memory and insight of the world during the stressful time of the tribulation judgments. If you've read this list in detail, to include part 1, the pre-tribulational rapture position has been shown to fail miserably in rightly dividing the word. 2 Timothy 2 verse 15. When Jesus began to speak of end times to his disciples, he stated in Matthew 24 verses 4 and 5, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." Jesus warned that there would be people set on deceiving his followers during the end times. Believers need to be on their guard. As tempting as it is to believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, it is but an intricate fabrication. And I referenced you to 2 Timothy 4:4 and 2 Peter 1 verse 16. There's a lot of hand-waving, smoke and mirrors, wishful thinking, sleight of hand, misinterpretation of Scripture, rewriting Scripture, and taking verses out of context just to make this position appear viable. Unfortunately, if you ask someone indoctrinated with the pre-tribulational rapture position, they will adamantly affirm that they are the only rapture position to interpret Scripture literally. As shown in this presentation, nothing could be farther from the truth. Adhering to a literal interpretation of Scripture can only lead, with an honest evaluation, to a post-tribulational rapture position. Again, for more information regarding this topic and other related topics, I highly recommend either of my books, The Rapture from the Ground Up or The Great Tribulation, again by Richard L. Guthrie, myself. Thank you for watching and for listening.